and it'll take a minute for it to connect. And
Okay, no problem.
just founder CEO of Tusk Strategies. The business.
Yeah, Tusk Ventures, Tusk Holdings is all sort of the same. It's all the same
Yeah.
shit. So whichever, pick whatever you like.
Okay, guys. I saw your TED talk. I enjoyed it immensely. It was
Oh,
very
thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Um,
It was a lot of work, but I think it paid off.
well, I think those are the best TED talks, the ones that are so seamlessly delivered, because you put so much time into getting every word right and every placement
Yeah,
right, and you
yeah,
make it
yeah.
powerful.
We did. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Um, that's I I grew up in Chicago, so I'm a Jordan fan, but I think that's kind of the analogy.
Where in Chicago were you?
Well, I went to undergrad at UIC, right
Hmm.
downtown, but I'm
Yep,
out in the suburbs now. So
got it. Okay, yeah, I lived there for 7 years. Little 1 year in Hyde Park, and then otherwise like Bucktown and Wicker Park.
it's great. Well, hey, we've got a good crowd coming in, and more folks will be coming in. I'm excited to chat today with Bradley Tusk, founder and CEO of Tusk Strategies, one of the nation's leading just political firms, consulting firms, thought leaders in this space. And I wanted to have this conversation with Bradley because I'm always kind of on the lookout for ways to save our democracy, to kind of protect the republic that we have, this very fragile republic that I think we're all seeing these last 6 months, especially. And I came across Bradley's book, Vote with Your Phone, that you can see right behind me. And if you saw his TED Talk, and if you haven't seen his TED Talk, I'll put it in the comments. You should check it out. It's amazing. But basically, we've got a really unique idea from Brad that I'm not seeing talked about enough. And as my work as a human rights lawyer is to elevate these ideas that don't really make it to the mainstream, but I believe they should. And I think this will make it to the mainstream because it needs to. It necessarily needs to. And so, kind of, let's start with the heart of it. You're convinced that mobile voting is one of the key ways to save our democracy, to
Yeah.
increase voter turnout. Let's talk a little bit about that. Why are you so high on mobile voting? What exactly would this entail?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first is sort of what's the problem? And I think most people watching this would agree we have a government that doesn't work. It is dysfunctional. It is polarized. Where things can get done, it's usually totally one sided from one party or the other. And basically, politicians stand around screaming at each other and pointing fingers. And whether it's climate or immigration or guns or healthcare or education or any big issue, even though the solutions are there, even though most people actually agree on the solutions to most of those problems, we can't actually execute it. And I've spent about first 15 years of my career were directly in government and politics, in city government, state government, federal government. And the thing that I took away from it all is every policy output is the result of a political input, which means every politician makes every decision solely based on the next election and nothing else. And there are exceptions. I was Mike Bloomberg's campaign manager in New York. Mike was an exception. Everyone watching this can think of a couple,
Sure.
but overall, that's what influences politicians. And because of gerrymandering, over 90% of elections are decided in the primary. And when primary turnout is typically 10 to 15%, which is what we have, that means that very small groups of voters ultimately dictate not only who wins office, but then what happens once they're in office. So it's either the far right or the far left or different special interests. And that's what gets us either dysfunctional government or totally one sided government. And so we know that we can't keep going this way, right? People's trust in government is at an all-time low,
Yeah.
cynicism at an all-time high. So the question becomes, how do you get, unless you could fix gerrymandering, you're stuck with primaries dictating the outcomes. How do
Yeah.
you get primary turnout from 10 to 30 to 40 to a bigger number that is more reflective of the views of the mainstream? And I kind of stumbled upon it by accident. I was running a campaign on the business side. I was running all the campaigns to legalize Uber all over the US. And at the time, when you think of Uber now, it's this giant corporation. But at the
Right.
time, we were this tiny, tiny little tech startup, and taxi was a really powerful industry. And the way that we won is that we were able to say to our customers, look, if you like this service and you want to keep having it, we need you to tell your elected officials that. And we created the functionality inside of the app that allowed our customers to tell their typically city council members, mayors, look, I like this Uber thing. Please leave it alone. And it worked. We
Yeah.
won in every single market in the country. And when this was happening, at some point, it kind of hits me like, God bless these people because they're making my job a lot easier. But my guess is they actually have no idea who their city council member is,
Sure.
and they don't vote in state
Yeah.
senate primaries or any of that. But when we just put it on their phones, their behavior changed. So that led to the question of, Well, what if they could vote on their phones? So that's what led to the creation of the mobile voting project in 2017. And then it's come in a couple of phases. So phase one was just testing the hypothesis.
Yeah.
Would
Well,
people use it?
let
Yeah,
me
go
go to
ahead.
the phases in 1 second
Sure.
because there's a lot of really thoughtful things you said that I want to unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's about accessibility ultimately, right? I mean,
Mhm.
voting is
Yeah.
mentioned in the Constitution multiple times as a right, and we've made it extraordinarily difficult, whether it's through gerrymandering, closing polling locations. Since Shelby fell in the Supreme Court, there have been more than 105,000 polling locations closed throughout the country. And it's making voter suppression kind of the strategy. We're seeing voter rolls being purged.
Yep.
It's an ongoing atrocity, a slow moving nightmare. One of the concerns that we hear often, Bradley, is voter integrity. And while we know that every single study done in this space has shown that our elections are actually very secure, there's very rare cases of voter fraud or election fraud. How do we ensure that our phones can't get hacked or
Yeah,
the data
sure.
can't get hacked and elections be switched by like a flip or
Totally.
something like that?
So, first of all, you're absolutely right. Election fraud, until Donald Trump made it up in 2020, was not an actual thing.
Yeah,
The Heritage Foundation, which is a very conservative foundation, did a study and found that 0.0000005% of elections experienced some sort of fraud. Or, you and I were talking before we went live about Chicago. I worked in Chicago politics for 4 years. That is as dirty and
yeah,
nasty as it gets. I testified in corruption trials. I got death threats. I mean, you name it, it
yeah,
happened. But guess what never came up once? Voter fraud. It's not
yeah.
a thing. But nonetheless, let's sort of, talk about it. We have spent 4 years building mobile voting tech specifically to be able to have something that is fraud resistant and secure to give people the confidence to vote on their phones. So the way it works is, so I know you live in the suburb. Which county are you in?
I'm in Naperville. I'm in DuPage County.
Okay, so you would go on the App Store, you would download the DuPage County Board of Elections app, and the first thing that would happen is they say, "Okay, are you really a registered voter in our county? You put information, fine. Next question, are you really you?" Right? So we do two things. The first is multi-factor authentication. So that's like when you forget your Google password, they send you a code, you put it in. Same thing here. Then biometric screening. So that's like clear at the airports, scan of your face, match up against your ID, just kind of like how you open your phone now.
Yeah,
And we've now established, okay, you're really you. Ballot comes up on the screen, and it on itself is meant to be as simple and straightforward as possible. But whenever you're done with it, you hit submit, and three things happen. First, your ballot's encrypted. Second, it's anonymized. Third, you get a tracking code like if it were a FedEx package, so you can track the progress of your ballot throughout the process. Then it goes back to DuPage County and they air gap it, which means once your ballot is totally offline and not connected to the internet, then they decrypt it. Then we print out a paper copy that gets mixed in with all the other ballots. You can see where your ballot stands through the tracking code that it was received, tabulated, printed, so on. And then the underlying code itself is totally open source. We're putting it
amazing.
all up on GitHub. So anybody can audit it, anybody can verify it. It's totally transparent.
That's
And when you compare that with the way we vote right now, I think it's a much more secure system.
No, I love that. And I mean, I think the fact that you guys have built in multiple ways to verify and validate it. What about the cost here? And this is a leading question I think the listeners will see because I think the first one thing folks will say is, how do we build this infrastructure? It's going to cost a ton of money.
Right.
We're already stretched thin on a number of things. We've got these tariffs coming in. You're you're proposing spending a ton more money on building this stuff out. How are we
Yeah.
going to be able to
So
afford
I'm actually not. I think is the leading question there.
it? Yeah,
I've already built it. I've already paid for it.
exactly.
So this is philanthropic. Look, so when I worked for Uber, I didn't grow up with a lot of money. I worked in government. I didn't make much money. And then I got super lucky, which was when I went to work for Uber, they couldn't afford my fee. And Travis Kalanick, who was the founder, said, "Hey, would you take equity?" I didn't even know what equity meant, but I was like, okay. And that became worth a lot of money. So
Great.
I have spent $20 million so far of my own money on mobile voting. I will continue to fund it. We're at the point now where the needs probably exceed my own budget. But we've already built the code. So it's free for any government to use. And by the way, any government around the world, I mean, I built it to try to help solve the problems in the US, but the truth is it could be used anywhere. And then ultimately, administering elections online is a lot cheaper. Now, my proposal is not to take away any current form of voting, just give people another option so that if, you like voting in person, go do that. You like voting by mail, great. But if it's better for you to vote on your phone, and for a lot of people it might be, that becomes an additional option. And then ultimately in 20 years, when really everyone is
Because
choosing to vote on their
ubiquitous.
phone, the cost of administering elections actually goes way down because you're not spending money on postage and you're not spending money on printing ballots, you're not spending money on, polling places and all that kind of stuff.
So, and this is a key point, and my apologies for asking that leading question, and I knew you would shoot it down perfectly because this is important. I think folks need to understand that we have in you an example of someone who is, putting their money where their mouth is, and you've done the work already. What about the pilot programs? To my understanding, there
Yeah.
have been a couple of dozen pilot programs
Yeah.
already. What has been the success of rolling this out? What have you learned? What
Yeah.
what can you improve upon?
Yeah, so the first thing we did was test the hypothesis of if you make voting easier, will more people do it? And so we funded elections in 7 different states, 21 different jurisdictions across the country, red states and blue states, by the way, where either deployed military or people with disabilities were able to vote in real elections on their phones. And of course, what we found is a lot more people do it, right? So, for example, Denver did a poll, people participated afterwards, and 100% said, yeah, I'd rather press a button than go somewhere, right?
Amazing.
Or in Seattle, they actually made for their conservation district, they made it available to anybody, and turnout tripled. That was still for small groups of voters. Those were tests, but we believe that um, every lesson we've learned in life. We do our baking on our phones. We do our healthcare on our phones. We do our love life on our phones. That, like, of course, we can vote on our phones. And if you make things easier and you put things in people's pocket, more people will do it.
That's exactly right. I love that, and I think one of the things I got from your TED talk when we talk about the next steps or what the future holds, you're optimistic. You're thinking that this thing can be adopted within the next decade on a nationwide scale. And in the grand scheme of things, a decade is nothing. I mean, that's a very short amount of time. What's your message to folks who are in the Gen Z, Gen Alpha stage of their life where they can play a meaningful role? What should they be
Yeah,
doing to
we're
be involved?
we're going to need your help. So here's everything I've said so far. I think is generally pretty good news and encouraging. Here's where it's going to get hard. People who have power don't like making it easier for other people to gain power,
Yeah.
which means we're going to face resistance. We have to pass legislation in every city and every state that allow mobile voting to happen, and we're going to have to do this over the objections of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and the unions and the business groups and the lobbyists, and we'll try to pick off as many as we can. But overall, people who know how to control the system as is like it that way. And so we're only going to win if we build a huge grassroots movement. And that's really going to be a lot of Gen Z and a lot of Gen Alpha. And if you think about it, every major right in history that's ever been won, the right to vote, the Civil Rights Act, the Americans Disabilities Act, same sex marriage, whatever it is, only happened because enough people stood up loud enough and long enough and they demanded their rights. And eventually the status quo had to give in. And that's what we're going to have to do here as well. And so we desperately need the support specifically of those two generations because that's our path to victory here. The initial thing is to go on mobilevoting.org and you can sign up and learn more. And then what we're really going to need you is when we start running legislation this fall in different cities is to make your voice heard to city council members, mayors, people like that, so they know you want this thing and not to let the special interest stand in the way.
Yeah, so mobilevoting.org, we'll plug that again when we push this out. That's where
Thank
they
you.
can go to get involved and get started. Bradley, one thing I'm fascinated about the way you think about these things is you're, I always get excited when I meet somebody who takes an idea that in hindsight looks so obvious, but have done all the hard work to make it look
Yeah.
obvious. Like you realize later on how much work actually goes into it. So I'm complimenting you that you've taken something that should be so obvious, but you've done the immense amount of work to
Yeah.
get there. Paint the vision. What does a future look like where we are properly integrating technology to strengthen our democracy and make our
Right.
democracy easier? What kind of folks are we electing in this space? What kind of
Yeah,
policies
and I'll
are we
go
passing?
right before I answer that though. So I agree with you so much that my second book, which was a novel, the title is obvious in hindsight. Literally for that reason.
Really
So
amazing,
yeah. So
amazing,
anyway, but it's a fun
amazing. I
novel.
love it.
It's about
Yeah.
flying cars. So look, it seems to me that if you start increasing turnout meaningfully. Let me give you an example. In 2019, Amazon decided they wanted to build out a second headquarters, and they had this national competition for cities all over the country to say, hey, do you want to be the one to host it? New York wins. and everyone's very, very excited. And then all of a sudden, AOC comes out and says, "Oh, I don't like capitalism, Amazon, tech, Bezos, whatever. We shouldn't do it." And a guy named Mike Gianaris was and still is the state senator for that part of Queens. And he says to himself, shit, all things being equal, like, of course I'd like 40,000 new jobs for my district. But if I do get a primary, it'll be from the left. Turnout will be about 10%. Those will be really AOC type voters. And there's a risk that if I support this deal, I could lose. And he had a choice: 40,000 new jobs for New Yorkers or one, his own. And he picked himself. And by the way, I think they're always going to do that. That's who runs for office, whether it's the Greek Senate or the Roman Senate or us now or any other time. The first thing is, how do we change their incentives, right? So if turnout in Generis' primary was 37% instead of 10, just based on the polling, he would have pushed the deal through simply because not because he would have cared any more about his constituents or New York or anything else, but simply because that's what would have been best for him politically. So the first thing is, when you start aligning the people's policy incentives with the politicians' electoral and political incentives, that's how you start getting things done. And by doing that, instead of right now, where all the incentives are to stand in the corner and scream and point fingers and call names, because the few people who do vote in your primary are the hardcore ideologues who don't want any sort of bipartisanship, don't want compromise, don't want to talk to the other side. Now you're incentivized to get things done. And so you start working with other people from the middle of your party, from the other party, and you build coalitions, which was how legislation worked in the US for hundreds of years until we fell apart. And if you think about it, on most issues, there are pretty common sense solutions that most of us could agree on. So, like, take guns. Most people would say we should either go into everyone's home and confiscate their guns. Also, shouldn't be easy to walk into a store and walk out with an assault rifle, right?
Right.
But those people don't vote in primaries,
Right.
so their views don't matter. And we either get people to say no guns ever or all guns all the time, and the end result is nothing, right? And we just have more school shootings. And there are solutions like that to pretty much everything. So the first thing is, voting itself becomes a lot easier, a lot more accessible. And by the way, there are specific groups of voters. I want this for everyone, but if you are disabled, like, imagine being blind, and we think voting's a pain in the ass. They have to, like, it's 10 times harder for them. And then they have to trust that the person at the polling place marked down the ballot the way they asked them to,
Right.
right? Or you're a soldier stationed, abroad
Anyway.
somewhere, and you mail in your ballot. It shows up 3 weeks after the election. It goes in the trash, right?
Yeah.
Or my daughter who's in college, right? Like, she doesn't. We live in New York City. She lives in Vermont for college. She can't vote without an absentee ballot. This is a kid who thinks email is antiquated,
Yeah.
so let alone snail mail, right? Or imagine if you lived in LA during the fires and there were elections, or North Carolina during the hurricanes, or whatever it is. There are so many different groups of people that already voting is hard for. So now we can make it a lot easier. We can increase turnout participation. We can change the underlying political incentives. They start working together to get things done again. And then the secondary effect of that is it starts to restore a little bit of faith in government, faith and trust in government, and basically all institutions. The church, higher ed, media, Wall Street are at all-time lows. This has been a trend since the 1960s. Basically, the Vietnam War, in my view, is really what kicked that off, which is you had an unjust war that the US president, from both parties, by the way, were lying to the American people about on television every single night.
Yeah.
And once it was found, and then Watergate came right after it, these two things happened in a row, people's faith really fell, and it's just been falling ever since. But if there were a government that said, oh, we've actually now come together and found solutions on climate, on healthcare, education, whatever it is, people might say, oh, okay, there's some reason to have some faith and optimism. And then, even more important, maybe you do get better people to run for office. Maybe the people watching the Substack right now, especially a lot of them are Gen Alpha and Gen Z, say, you know what? I normally would never think about that because it would feel like a bad use of my time. But if I could get things done, then I might love that. And by the way, whether you run for office or work in government, we can bring better people into the system and then have a better product for Americans, a better democracy. And then the choices we make hopefully will become reflected around the world.
Absolutely. I love that vision, Bradley. I mean, I think the more we can facilitate communication between citizens and the elected, the more we can facilitate communication between individual people to encourage each other to vote and to make it easy. And you brought up some great examples of people who might have a disability or might be in the military. But look, I'm a parent. I've got childcare. I've got an elderly in-law living with me. Imagine if I don't have to, restructure my entire day just to go vote
Yeah.
because I have other human beings who depend on me to be there for them.
Yeah, or imagine you're a service worker and you get paid by the hour. Your boss isn't giving you
Right.
the time off. Or you know who's a supporter of ours? Actually, the nursing union, because they're like, we can't get out of the
That's
hospital
right. Yeah, you
to
can't
go
tell someone,
vote,
don't
right?
die
Well,
until I
someone's
get
going to
back. I mean,
die,
that's
right? So, like, you do have all of these people who would like to be able to vote, and we make it really harder for them. So, yeah, it could just make a big difference in so many people's lives.
Brett has been great. I put the mobilevoting.org in the
Thank you.
chat. We'll put it out when we post this. Last question before you go, and we hope
Yeah,
to do this again because I'm loving
we
the
would love to.
conversation.
Yeah,
This is a very significant innovation in the way our elections are run. I'm going to be pushing for it. You've made me a believer.
thank you.
What's next? What other changes do you want to see that you think we need to stay focused on and pay attention to in
Yeah.
terms of
So,
technology
so
to democracy?
in terms of technology specifically, and let me veer off of voting for a second here, if
Please,
that's
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
Um, I think there are a few regulations that really have to happen. So, do you know what Section 230 is?
yeah,
So,
yes,
okay. So, for the viewers who might not know, when there was a law passed in Congress in 1996 that said that internet platforms are not liable for the content posted by their users. And by the way, when the internet was a brand new thing, it actually made sense, right? You kind of needed to remove the legal risk to incentivize the creation of platforms, but no one had any idea about social media. And ever since, it's been a giant disaster because the platforms have an economic incentive to show you the most toxic content possible because human beings have an evolutionary negativity bias. It's how we know to like leave the house when you smell gas or turn the other way when you see a tiger or whatever. And as a result, we're just more likely biologically to click on negative headlines and positive headlines. The platforms aren't dumb. They know this. And guess what? Nothing we can do about it because they have this legal protection. So they feed everyone horrible content, content to teenage girls about how to cut themselves, how to have eating disorders, just terrible things. And it results in, massive problems, teen suicide, self-harm, bullying, discrimination, all these problems. Congress could fix it, with one change. Just said, look, just like the regular media is liable for what they say. And if they say something or do something that is truly over the line, they can be sued for it. Same thing here. And that would really change the way that we moderate content on the internet. So that's really critical. Also, AI, as it's emerging, now is the time to at least try to develop sensible frameworks for how to regulate it. We're not going to know everything that AI is going to be, so you can't predict every regulation. In fact, my day job now is running a venture capital fund where we invest in startups in highly regulated industries. And typically, you can't pass the regulation until our founder invents the thing in the first place, right?
yeah.
Otherwise, no one knows it exists. But we know enough about AI now to know, okay, what are some of the real potential harms? Deep fakes, right, is clearly a harm. Surveillance technology could clearly be a harm. I mean, there are things that we know, and why not start to pass laws to say, at least in the areas where AI could be really problematic, why don't we get out ahead of it as best we can? So, I think, to deal with this information, deal with some of the things, there's a bunch that government can do at the state level, at the federal level. And so, I've been working on those issues and trying to make them happen.
Amazing. Bradley Tusk, founder, CEO of Tusk Strategies. The website is mobilevoting.org. Go there, click, get signed up, get involved. And Bradley, you're doing the Lord's work. I appreciate this
Thank
immensely.
you.
Let's have you back on soon to talk more
Would
about
love
this
to.
issue.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, my friend. Take care.